James Wolfenson was born into very modest circumstances in Sydney. He was educated through the public school system in Sydney, Wallara, and then Sydney Boys High. Went to Sydney University. Then, and I think this is probably a major influence on his life, was educated at Harvard Business School. And Sir James, if you don't mention it in your speech, I'll ask questions about it, because I know you've maintained a lifelong association with Harvard. Managed to get into on the basis of that business education, the field of corporate advisory, corporate finance and banking in Sydney, and then on through London, New York, and eventually really at the highest heights of international banking, because Sir James was the head of the World Bank for a decade. And I think in that position, it would be fair to say that Sir James was easily the most influential Australian born person in the entire world. With all due respect to Prime Ministers of this country, the World Bank is kind of a little more influential because it affects every single developing country in the entire world. And since then he's gone on to philanthropic as well as business interests. So truly, as his own autobiography indicates, a global life. And I know that there's some people in the audience who have a copy of that book. They would just love to get a virtual signature, Sir James, but the Cisco technology isn't good enough to do that. So, alas, we have to rely on your presence instead. And can I ask you to address this conference of the Institute of Public Administration?
Well, I think that this must be some sort of conspiracy, because I'm coming up to my 80th birthday, and they probably didn't want to show an old man lecturing such a young and effective group. But I am very grateful for the chance of talking to you, and I hope someone there is getting in touch with Cisco here so that we can have two-way visual communications. Let me start by saying that I appreciated very much the invitation, and was told that I had 20 to 30 minutes to speak, and was presented with a list of subjects which might take up the whole of your conference. And so I'm reluctant to respond to all of them, but I will try to give you some of the highlights that I've experienced in this last 80 years, and some of the changes that I've seen that I think could have relevance to what you believe and to what you're doing. The first, of course, is that when I was a youngster in 1933, we had a rather small population in Australia. It was at that time, if I understand correctly, around 6 million people. And the global population then was about 2 billion. That 2 billion grew to 1950 when it was 2.5 billion. And as you know, since then it reached 6 billion by the year 2000, and we're projecting a 9 billion population by 2050. The important thing in this, I think, is that for centuries before the first billion came on our planet, we had a relative balance, and indeed until 2050, or until the year 2000, we had a pretty good history of a balance between China and India and the rest of the world. When I say the rest of the world, I'm talking particularly about what we might now call the OECD countries. And in the early 1800s, China and India were roughly equal to the UK, Holland, and all the other developed countries. And so there was a balance in the world that was, I think, important and was sustained. May I just say that I'm getting pretty annoyed about this not being able to see you guys. Has someone in Australia been in touch with them here? Have you been trying to get the connection?
Yes. The techs are onto it. They're trying to. I know we've got a camera in the room, which is
yes, we do.
Going to hopefully get turned around and show the audience, but it's being worked on as we speak.
Okay, good.
But can I assure you, we can all see you, and people are interacting. They're keeping eye contact and all of those sorts of things. It's just a pity you can't see it.
Oh, I see. Okay, well, so long as you can see me in my beautiful tie and suit, that's all I was worried about. What I want to say is that in the period that I grew up, and in the period after 1950, which essentially was when I was at the university in Australia, the big issue for us was what we did with the historic ties that we had with Europe and the United States, with the OECD countries. And indeed, for the period between 1950 and the year 2000, as probably many of you know, there was a pretty good balance maintained, which said that the billion people in the rich countries were able to have 80% of the global GDP, and the 5 billion people that were in the developing countries had 20% of the global GDP. And that 5 billion, of course, included China and India, Africa, and all the other developing countries. And for a period of about 30 years, that was pretty stable. It started to change marginally in 1990, and by the year 2000, it started to change significantly. So people of my generation grew up with the feeling that the so-called rich world, the Europes and the United States and Japan, had some sort of right to the income of the planet. And there were a whole bunch of other people, including China and India, that were the developing countries, and we sort of had to look after them or come up with some sort of methodology that we could use their natural resources, make sure that they were okay, but there was never a sense of any competition from the developing world. Now, what is remarkable is what has happened in the last 12 years and what is projected to happen, most assuredly, between now and 2050. And I think this is the first place to start. The 80-20, which we had, lasted for some time, till 2000, but the 80% by 2050 that the so-called rich countries have will be down to 35 to 40%. And by the way, Australia is included in that group of rich countries. And the dominant countries in the world will be in Asia, with at least 50% of the global GDP being in that part of the world. The number one economy will, of course, be China, something that I would guess is pretty well known to all of you in the audience there. And I'm sure that a number of you have not only visited, but have sought to expand your understanding and the activities that you have with China. And some 10, 15 years behind that is coming India, which at an early stage, I would say, certainly before 2050, you will see India developing more, so that it will assume a place of probably number 3 in global economy, but will assuredly be on the run in terms of its position in the global scene. What is clear is that China and India will be, on a purchasing power basis, number 1 and number 3 in the world. And you will have as number 2 in the world, of course, the United States, but in terms of purchasing power parity, being nudged by India. And when we look at the top 20 countries in the world, you will find definitively a significant movement by developing countries coming in to be in the top 12 or 13 out of the 20. I remember the very first time that the developing countries were invited to go to a G7 or G8 meeting was when President Chirac invited them, or invited 5 of them, to come to Paris for such a meeting. I was privileged at that time, along with my colleague at the Monetary Fund, to attend those meetings. And the first person to speak was the President of China, who you would, as imagined, came with a very well-tutored speech, of course in Chinese, took the 12 minutes that was allotted to him and indicated that he thought that China had a future and that it was a good thing to be there at the meeting. The second person to speak was Prime Minister Vajpayee from India. He spoke in English, but few of us could understand his accent. But I did read the speech afterwards, and that too talked of the future of India. But the third person to speak was the President of Brazil, President Lula, who, after spending the first 3 or 4 minutes saying how proud his parents would have been to see him in that company, he said, all I could suggest to you is, why don't you next year have the meeting in Brazil, because it won't be long before a number of you will not be at this meeting, and you might as well get used to coming to visit some of the incoming countries. And, of course, that was true, because Brazil and Mexico, Indonesia, a number of countries with which you're familiar, are now part of a very different world. And the very different world is a world, if you like, not of 80-20, but of probably 35-65. And in Asia, you have this extraordinarily large advance of which you're very familiar in terms of both economics and in terms of human development. That is the new phase that I think your public service and Australians will need to get to know. And in reading some materials about the conference and about those that are putting it forward, I don't have any doubt that the public servants have a clear understanding of what is going on now and the relationships with the rich countries. It'd be my hope that you're doing more than the United States, which really is not reaching out to get an appropriate understanding of the future. And I regret to say top people in the country are really paying some deference to the developing world. But in fact, in terms of elections and in terms of what they really talk about, and I am just quoting in now our president in the United States, who in these recent times has not mentioned the issue of development, notwithstanding the fact that he's under a fair amount of pressure at this time. So we have, in my expectation, in my experience, we have a situation where there is this growth going on of enormous proportions, so much of it just north of Australia, and the developed world of the OECD, which has, roughly 20% of the global income, that world has done very, very little. 80% of the local income, I should say, has done very, very little to prepare itself for the time when the 80% will be 35%. And I regret this very much. And I do think that if Australia had the will to do it, it is, of course, connected so much with Asia in terms of its trade, in terms of its proximity, and it would be fantastic if Australia could provide the link that is non-existent at the moment between that group of countries and the group of countries which will be totally dominant. And it's not just economics, it's on many other issues that apply to the world of 2050 and the world of the future. One of them, of course, is the issue of what's going to happen with the various populations. In the so-called rich world, we're seeing a huge change in terms of the nature of the populations. I'm happy to say that I'm alive at this time because the people of 60 years and over have risen from 8% of the world population in 1950, and there's a projection now that by 2050, that group of people, 80 and above, will in fact be 22% of the population. That is an enormous change with, as I'm sure as you know, very significant economic implications for national policy. I'd also say that the change in this distribution faces the population and the government with an enormous number of challenges, as it does as the other end of the spectrum. And here I'd like to talk about Africa for a moment. Africa, for those of you that have not followed it, has grown relatively fast from the hundreds of millions of people to getting close now to 1 billion people. It's roughly 800 million. And by 2050, it is thought that it will just be approaching 2 billion people in a global population of 9 billion. So all of a sudden, you will have an Africa with 20% of the global population, 20%, but distributed in 53 countries, which on its face, of course, indicates that they have some trouble in getting together. And indeed, I've spent an enormous amount of time in Africa, and we don't yet have either the maturity or the willingness to come together in ways that could unite those countries, even on a regional basis or even on an ethnic basis, to bring about a coordinated approach to their future. They're being used now, as you know, by China and other places, largely because of their natural resources. I had a resonance of that in terms of Australia when I was growing up in my professional career. But the one thing that Australia had was that it did have alongside the natural resource boom appropriate education, appropriate governance, a lack of corruption, or a significant lack of corruption. It had all the services that are required. But I regret to say that in Africa at the present time, those are not the conditions into which it's entering the next half of the century. And we will have, I think, for the world to understand a dichotomy between the richer countries, which will have older populations, and I've talked to you a little bit about some of that, and at the other end of the scale, you'll have a very young population, extremely young population, in Africa. And the young African population will be substantially frustrated, as it is already, in terms of getting jobs and in terms of using whatever education they get. And this is a huge problem which the world is going to have to face. When I was growing up, we didn't really think of problems in Africa as having any relevance to us. They were all part of colonial empires. But that is not the case today. There are 53 independent countries now in Africa, and with a substantially greater percentage of global population. So we can no longer ignore the African scene. And the African scene is very different today because young people are no longer scurrying about for food or having the image of having spears to go out and hunt. In Africa, the fastest growing development is the use of cell phones. And that is changing the nature of the planet on which we live. And it's changing it in a number of ways as I get to another issue, which is an issue of technology, which just very simply in terms of communications is changing the world in which we live, and in particular, the developing world. I was recently in the Arab countries, and in the Arab countries, if you just even watch television during the time of the Egyptian uprising, what was fascinating was that the commentaries were being given not just by Egyptians, but by Arabs from very many other countries. And that was as a result of television, of course, but also communications with the cellular radio. And so when one talks of the world becoming smaller, which is a common phrase, the issue of that for the world in terms of its stability is that appreciation of governments in the countries of the Middle East is now significantly less because there is a new set of relations between the young people. And that is a very serious development and will, I believe, be a serious development also in Africa. And so I think the challenge to governments in the countries that are developing is going to be to stay in power. I might add that in the United States, more and more people are giving less and less attention and less credence to our own government in this country. I'm quite certain in Australia that would not be the case because of the excellence of the politicians in Australia. But in some other countries, that is not the case. And we're seeing now a changing pattern on our planet, a changing pattern that is brought about by increased communications and brought about by need. And when you have 20-25% of the young people in Africa without jobs, they're going to be able to move and they're going to be able to communicate with each other. And when we see changes in the Arab world in terms of the distribution of resources, and when we see what is happening now in terms of Iran, when we see what's happening in terms of the Sunni-Shia conflict, I have to say that the communications issue is going to be a very, very important element in what is happening. I see that our chairman is coming there, and I've obviously seem to be outdoing my time, but I want to just say to you a couple of quick things.
You have another 5 minutes at least.
All right, well, if I have another 5 minutes, let me quickly go through these notes that I have, because one of the things that is changing for all of us, of course, is the issue of the environment. And my colleague Nick Stern came out with what I thought was a fantastic report some years ago, and I'd recommend to some of you to read the 700 pages. But if you don't want to do that, there's some excellent summaries, which, of course, indicate that all of us are going to be in a position where we have to face the results of global warming. And I can't get into it now, but I think you would have had some recent examples in Australia with the fires in Australia, which indicate that at least in Australia, they are having some impact by what is going on a global basis. And of course, Nick then talked about the greenhouse gases, in which we could spend another hour or more in terms of looking at what is happening. But I won't do that now. I would simply flag the issue as being something that is extraordinarily important to Australia. And I've read recently some commentary, and as an issue in terms of utilization of the lands, no doubt this is going to be a very significant issue. Other issues I wanted to cover were the issue of health and the developments in health. I wanted to talk about changes in governance, and I wanted just to touch on the issue of corruption, largely because it's something that I was hugely involved in my period in international service. And let me say that the OECD countries may have an excellent record with some little blotches at the edges, but the issue of corruption is still alive and well today in too many of the countries in the world. And while I would like to discuss it longer, let me simply flag it as I move on to the issue briefly to mention that the balance in the world in terms of religions is also changing. We will have by 2050 2.6 billion people of the Muslim faith in the world, out of a world population at that time of probably 11 billion, close to a third. And the thing that I think is so hugely important is that what is happening in the Middle East and what is happening in Turkey and what is happening today in terms of issues of regional stresses in terms of religion is no longer something that we can ignore. It is part and parcel of the current conflicts in the Middle East with Sunni Shia issues, and as I said, issues in relation to Iran, but it's something which Australia and the OECD countries have never had to face. But the key point that I'm trying to make in this set of observations is that we can no longer sit happily with the 30 or so countries of the OECD and think of ourselves comfortably as having 80% of the global GDP. That is no longer the situation. And to my regret, in this country and in many other countries that I visited, the wealthy countries of the past are simply not facing up to the challenges. And the last point I'll make to you is that we have in this country now 200,000 this year, 200,000 young Chinese coming to have university education in this country. We have 110,000 young Indians, and I know both those countries come to Australia. But in return, we have roughly 12,000 Americans going to China and 3,500 going to India. This is a result of the old balance. And what I would hope you as leaders in the community might be able to do is to bring about an understanding not only in your own organizations that the future is not just internal, well, good management, and it's no longer the relationships that you've had in the past, but I'm sure you're already focusing on and leading the people in Australia to understand that this next years before 2050 are going to be totally different from the years before the year 2000, and we better get ready for it. Thank you very much indeed for the opportunity to talk to you.
So, James, we are hoping that you will have some time to take questions from the audience, because what you've done is raised a wonderful agenda of issues and ideas for us. We know you have another engagement and you have to battle the traffic of New York to get to it, but if you had a little time for questions, we'd be grateful. I
have plenty of time. I've probably got too much time for your purposes, but anyway, I'm around.
Thank you very much for that. So we're getting the lights up in the room, so you might be able to see some faces that were previously very, very dim. My role was down as discussant, and the organisers wanted me to spend 10 minutes as discussant. I won't do that. I'll spend 2 or 3 instead to give the audience plenty of time. But I wanted to reflect on a connection that I had with yourself, about 12, 13 years ago. At that time, I was in the public service, responsible for the Australian budget and financial management as a Deputy Secretary in our Finance Department, and I was lucky enough to be asked by the World Bank to join a group of senior World Bank executives at a intensive management course that you'd organised through the Harvard Business School in conjunction with a number of other institutions for your top executive. And one of the key texts was an important article from Harvard Business Review by Chris Argyris about why smart people fail to learn. And it was striking because all of your people at the World Bank were incredibly smart people. I was in a study group, for example, with Kayo Kochweser, who then became finance minister for Germany, and incredibly smart people. But they had enormous blind spots as well. And there were all these things that it turned out they didn't really know. And one of the fascinating things about that experience, and I think it was your and Harvard Business School's design of it, was that you'd brought in people from other public services like myself, but also from private companies, and also importantly from the not-for-profit sector, some of the big NGOs. And it was really fascinating to see some of your very smart people suddenly scales lifted from their eyes when they realised that they didn't know everything, and some of these other people might know something that was useful for them. And what that made me think about was you kindly said that we have a very intelligent and capable public service audience here in the room, and we do, and it's nice that we do. But are there any parallels in terms of that reaching out? How do you get people who are capable and smart to also reach out, and how important is that in the world that you're describing that we're leading up to in 2050? So I'll make that our first question, and we're already starting to get quite a few in from the texts, and I'll also call on the audience. But would you like to start off with that one?
Well, I would indeed, because I had very great respect for the World Bank and indeed for many of the international institutions. But what I discovered when I came with the responsibility of running it was that people lived in their own little ecosystem. If you were responsible for assistance to Ethiopia, you knew everything that you could know about Ethiopia, and you were a profound expert on the subject. But your knowledge of what was happening in Japan or in the international community or in Asia became very, very small. And so I found myself at the institution with a remarkable set of specialists in health or in some substantive subjects or in terms of geographical subjects. And people became very comfortable in that. They had walls around them. And not only that, but they were closed off to the outside community. We used to get hundreds of letters from civil society, and they all got the same answer. Thank you very much for writing. We'll get back to you, or we'll look into it. But there was no interchange. There was no dialogue. And I figured that the world was different, that you couldn't live in these boxes. And the reason for starting these courses at Harvard, or they could have gone on anywhere, was to introduce them to a methodology that would broaden their interest, would have participants from those other segments of the community, and really wake people up. And I have to say it had a very, very good effect for a period of years. It's the sort of thing which, quite honestly, I think needs to be done with some regularity because people get comfortable again. But I think the role of people in government service today is a role that needs to be made uncomfortable. It needs to be made uncomfortable by all the changes that are going on, of which I mentioned a few. And I might add that even for the people presiding over, whether it's president of the World Bank or the people around him, it's equally important for them to stand back with regularity and say, what the hell is happening to the world? Because the changes are happening so quickly today, and it's impossible for an individual, even if he wants to keep up to date on everything that's going on, that I think that working as a team, but more important than working as a team, recognizing as a factor that Australia is now different in terms of its relationship. When I was growing up, the only thing that you were worried about was if you could go to Oxford or Cambridge. I tried to get a scholarship to go to Japan, but there was only one and they weren't having it that year. And certainly the Chinese were interested in other things at that moment in revolution. But what is critical, I think, and I think it's an immense opportunity for Australia with an immigrant population. And when I was there recently, I was happy to see an Asian immigrant population, which wasn't there when I was going through school. What I think is an opportunity for Australia is to grasp the nettle and become truly internationalist. You've got a great education system, you've got a whole bunch of immigrants, and there is a need for leadership. And for me, it's both an enormous challenge and an opportunity for Australia. But if you don't grasp it, you're going to be left behind.
Now, look out to the audience and take the first hand that goes up as a question. Right in the middle, up here.
May I suggest that you call me Jim? This Sir James is a mistake.
Yeah. I was actually going to ask you what we should call you because I did meet you briefly in Washington, and at that time you were Jim. Sometimes, though, we have to venerate our elders. We've been told that through this conference.
Please don't. I cannot hear, I'm sorry.
There's a microphone in the room, I believe. Use your handset, press the microphone button.
I was wondering if you thought that public administrations in developing countries have things that public administration systems in the developed world could actually teach us, or whether you think the education model is still a sort of one-way process.
Well, I think in Africa there are some advances in one or two countries, but not tremendously great. I think in Latin America it's a very small group of countries. I think what is critical, however, is that the need is clear in Australia about what you have to do if you buy my proposition. And you have an opportunity with the scale of the population and the flexibility that you can use because of your international connections. I believe, and I've thought this for a while, I believe that you could create new ground. I don't think that there is anyone for you to copy, to be quite honest. I think if you go back to the European countries, many of them have relationships with their former colonies. But in terms of a global approach, I don't think they have it. The country that I have most respect for in terms of the training it's giving its civil servants is China. China is really doing a thorough job. And if you watched the proceedings that they just had in their Congress, and you listen to some of the speeches made by the leaders, I think you would find that in many ways they're hoping to be a true international leader beyond even that they've got now. And I don't think they're way ahead. I think certainly they're training many, many young people. But why can't Australia do that? Why can't you train many more than you are already? I know that it's a very good part of income earning in Australia to be training Asians, but why not send a whole bunch of Australians regularly to train in Asia? It seems to me that just training Asians about what happens in our part of the world is only half the issue. Now, maybe it's already happening, but it was not happening a couple of years ago when I looked into it, and if I'm wrong in my assumptions, I apologize.
I think it's worth noting that in my dealings with the Chinese civil service, they're extraordinarily proud of their history, and it's worth reflecting that the Chinese have had a very high-functioning bureaucracy with merit-based competitive examination entry for at least 1,500 years. So they had some of the things that we think are the hallmarks of a well-functioning bureaucracy at a time when in Europe most public servants or most public service involved hitting people around the head with a broadsword. So that brings us to a question. We're very social media here, Jim, and people are texting and twittering in questions as well. And someone has asked what you think about Europe and whether the struggles that European economies are facing are going to continue.
Well, I think Europe is having certainly a very difficult period relative to its earlier assumptions that there would be continued growth in Europe, continued comfort in Europe as part of the OECD, as many Americans thought that there would be continued comfort in the United States. But when you look at the financial statistics in terms of the borrowings levels of the banks, when you look at the flows of trade, and when you look at the dominance really of Germany within that context, I think you would have to say that there are many things which need to be fixed in Europe. What I think is interesting as a personal observation is that I think the United States has been more honest thus far, or if not more honest, has been forced to be more outward giving of what's happening in the companies and in the banks than is true under the European legal system. I think that will change, but I think at the present moment Europe is not having its best time, and I believe that there are many things which need to be fixed in Europe.
Now I'm going to alternate between texted questions and questions from the audience. So the next one from the audience. Oh, I now have choices. I'll take that one further towards the front here, and the next one will be up the back, so down here.
Jim, how do you see kind of public service and administration deal with the problems of accountability and governance in the financial markets, particularly in America? I mean, there seems to be a breakdown in trust and sustainability.
Look, there has. First of all, structurally, as I think you probably know, my former partner, Paul Volcker, has had a commission, the Volcker Commission, which recommended a split between the deposit-taking functions and the plain banking functions, and those functions that were involved in markets and market presence and involvement in making money through that side of the business. And there is a very lengthy report which has yet to be put into practice, and it is being resisted substantially by the banking system. At the same time, in the United States, within the framework of existing regulations, what we're seeing now is a coming to judgment. And if you looked at today's paper and saw the fines of the Morgan Bank, which has historically been at the top of the league table in terms of its position and its leadership, today's fine was $13 billion this morning, but that's a financial fine, and the authorities have said that doesn't clear what we might do against individuals. So there is an enormous change occurring in the United States at this moment, and an enormous change occurring in terms of recognition of issues. And I believe that you're going to see some more of that in Europe, but it's very clear that it's happening in this country, and I think it's healthy. There's a bit of noise going on there.
Suddenly the noise level in the room bounced incredibly high, but it's now back to stability. Here's a texted question, and the session just prior to you, Jim, we had two former senior ministers talking about politics and the public service. This is probably a question that they should have stayed around to listen to your answers, because if you have the answer to this, the whole of the ministerial group will be interested. The question is, how do you believe that popular political engagement can be rebuilt in countries like ours? That disengagement that people are feeling that you mentioned from their politicians, how can that kind of trust be restored?
Well, look, let me just say in relation to the United States and many other countries with which I've dealt, the model that is followed in the UK and Australia and Canada is very different than the model, for example, that is followed in this country. The senior civil servants typically are political appointees, and they carry out essentially the directions of the president and his policies. And when you go into the Treasury Department, for example, after a change in president, you cannot find anybody that was in the previous administration there to talk to. I personally believe that that is much less efficient than a system of continuing civil servants that have their expertise, as you do in Australia, and you can carry forward with advice to the political figures. But in the US, it's gone exactly in the reverse thing, and the same is true in France. The same is true in many countries in Europe. So you have a very, very different system. And the only thing that I think you need to make sure that your system works is that you have people in senior positions who understand the political process well and who are prepared to deal with their ministers on the basis not just of what they think, but of what the minister thinks. And my appreciation of Australian civil servants is that they are able to make those changes. But I can assure you, in this country, that possibility is not being dealt with. In this country, they changed the whole team.
We had another question from the audience right up the back. People sitting on either side of the room, you're allowed to ask questions too, so wave vigorously and we'll get to you, but up the back of the centre section. Yes, sir. And hold your handset right up to your mouth so we can all hear you.
You spoke during the session about the need for the OECD to effectively wake up. Do you believe the current economic crises facing Europe and the United States are the trigger? Or do you think there are other social or political global triggers that will bring them on board?
Look, I think what is interesting in this country, in the United States at the moment, is that there is a very substantial financial challenge, but it's not at this moment front and center. As you know, the Federal Reserve is providing very, very substantial assistance every month, and our interest rates are down at 0.5%, and the question is to re-stimulate the economy. The issue is going to come with our new head of the Federal Reserve, and what I read in the paper today, some views of some members of the Federal Reserve Board, that they are going to try and cut back on the stimulus program, and that was already reflected the moment that rumour came out in the stock market. So you're going to have a substantial adjustment, because what you cannot have is the Fed having a bloated balance sheet bigger than it's ever been without some mechanism to try and reduce it. The intervention of the Fed was to try and modulate the progress and re-stimulate, but not to give permanent support. And what we will see, I think, in the period ahead is a resolution of that, and I myself am not yet clear on how they're going to resolve it.
And there was one in the aisle over here. We're meant to be a very technologically savvy audience, but at times even the best technology can defeat us. Have you pressed the microphone button? Oh, well, that's sad. Just shout, and maybe I can relay it through.
China and corruption separately. My question is, I think your explanation for height of the corruption problem that he's currently facing at the moment, as the report I'm sure you're very well aware of.
So the question I'll relay through is your assumption about growth in China predicated on China being able to control corruption, or will growth in China happen despite the kinds of reports of corruption that are currently filtering through from China?
Look, I think that one of the biggest issues facing China at the moment is the issue of corruption. And the action of the new leadership is most certainly trying to impact the most visible forms of corruption, be they relatively unimportant in terms of dollars, where officials eat, how much they eat, how they travel, what cars they have. All these indicia of corruption are being attacked. And a number of officials at reasonably high level have been brought to account by a member of the Politburo and are being attacked. The real question is going to be, will any of the leaders of former governments or any of the high-ranking officials in the present government be subjected to the sort of examination that some of the lesser figures are being looked at? And I think from my Chinese friends, there are those who think it will never happen, and the younger ones all hope it will happen. But there is in China undoubtedly internally substantial corruption. And I might add that externally they have not signed on to any of the international agreements in terms of corrupt payments when they go overseas. As a result of that, I have very little doubt that in projects of China, and by the way, a number of other countries, that you have typically a 20 or 30% loss in terms of development projects. That's a figure that I used when I was at the bank. I tried to cut it down, and I had the view that if you could get it down to 5%, you were pretty good. But when it was 20 to 30%, it was too much. And I regret to say that, sadly, I believe that a number of countries, including China, still participate in corrupt practices. And they do it not only abroad, but in their own country.
Though it is also worth reflecting on the role of countries like Australia. The World Bank did a fascinating study on corruption in developing countries that found that multinational companies working in developing countries were more likely to pay bribes than local companies. In other words, there's a lot of expectations about how things will be done that companies in Australia have that we actually take to other countries with us. There's one last question, and we'll finish off with this one, that appropriately has come through from Twitter, asking whether you believe that technology will lead to greater connectivity and democratisation around the world.
Well, I touched on that before when I was talking about the young Egyptians and what I anticipate in Africa. I think if you have a governance system which is only from the top, and people in the community get their information only from the top and from newspapers that are heavily supervised by the government, you have a situation where an ability to think beyond what the current situation is very, very limited. But what is clear in terms of what recently happened in Egypt and what is happening now in Egypt and in many other countries, and I would say also now in Africa, is that individuals are bypassing government. They are getting more information internationally. More young people are coming together in networks. And I would say that the biggest factor in that is communications. I do want to say one other thing before I leave this, but I want you to know that until 1996, no international organization, including the World Bank, no leader had ever mentioned the word corruption. When I wrote my second speech and passed it to the lawyer in the bank, he asked me to come out of my office to talk to him. And I said, "Why don't you come in? What the hell are you talking about?" And he said, "No, I need to talk to you outside." And I went outside, and unusually, instead of calling me Jim, he called me Mr. President. And he said, "Mr. President, you cannot use the C word in your speech." And I said, "What the hell is the C word?" And he whispered, "Corruption." And I said, "Why can't I use the C word?" And he said, "Because maybe half of the people on your board represent corrupt countries." And since that time, of course, there are many, many speeches made at the World Bank and elsewhere, and there's been a profusion of groups that have come together to fight corruption. But I do want to say to the gentleman that raised this earlier that the corruption issue is indeed a problematic issue, and it's one that I think Australia has been very, very free from. And it's another thing that I think, if I could only have my hope about Australia's leadership in Asia, it would be one of the things that I would hope Australia can put its hand on its heart and say, it is possible to have economic development without this, and we want to show you how to do it. I want to thank you very much for letting me speak to you. I wish I could spend more time. I'm sorry that my answers were so brief, but I have no doubt that when I reach the age of 120 and come back to speak to you again, that there will have been much progress made. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jim. That was absolutely superb. We had wanted a global perspective from a global citizen, and that's what we got.